Hello, I'm Tom Rhea. I knew Raymond Scott. I also knew Robert A. Moog, and the idea of how the men were like each other or unlike each other has come up as they knew each other well, were friends, and associates in some sense. First of all, Robert Moog was not exactly an engineer, he was a PhD physicist. And as a matter of fact, Bob joked that he defined an engineer as someone who could build for 2 cents what any damn fool could build for 3 cents. It wasn't meant to be cutting. There were some fine engineers at the Moog Company that Bob worked with. But I think that academic grounding is one of the first things that you'd have to make a contrast with Robert A. Moog and Raymond Scott. Bob had a PhD. As a matter of fact, it was in a very abstruse topic, the salt crystals and how they vibrated and such like that. It wasn't really even close to music. And Raymond Scott always told me, he said, I have a doctorate in primitive engineering. And I think that's the difference between someone who is schooled, as Robert Moog was, and somebody possibly that you could say, about engineering at least, was not schooled. Also, Robert A. Moog was a physicist, engineer, who leaned toward music. Raymond Scott was a brilliant musician who leaned toward electronics and engineering. So their skill sets were almost perfectly complementary. And I would like to clear something up. Bob Moog did not work for Raymond. He did tasks that Raymond had him do. And of course, Raymond did not work for Bob Moog. This is some of the mythology that's grown up. Temperament. Well, I'm told that there's a conversation on the phone that's been recorded between Bob and Raymond, and that Raymond did most of the talking. And I laughed and I said, well, that would be about right. Now, Bob was the kind of person who wasn't loquacious. He wasn't taciturn, but he spoke very carefully. He did not want to speak and then, think later, well, that's not what I meant to say, and things like that. Raymond was a house of fire. He was loaded with so many ideas and had such an artistic temperament that it just came out that way. When I was with him, he would spin off one idea after another. It was really kind of amazing. So, temperamentally, they were different kinds of people. I think Bob also had been taught the academic tradition of exposing what it is you know. That's what we academics do. We teach, and Bob has taught. For instance, he wrote a paper explaining voltage control for the whole world to see very shortly after he developed his modular 900 series synthesizer, some of which you see behind me here. Raymond, on the other hand, was extremely secretive. When I first met Raymond doing dissertation research out of George Peabody College in Nashville, Tennessee, Bob Moog had told me, you got to go see 3 people, Wendy Carlos, Eric Sade, and Raymond Scott. Well, I went to see Raymond. And he was very secretive. I had to sign a disclosure. At a little later time in our relationship, I represented Raymond trying to rent his Clavivox into the studios in Nashville, Tennessee, where I lived. Now, there was a 4-page document, as a matter of fact, that Raymond sent me, and of course I duly signed it. It had such things as I was to put a lock on the Clavivox lid so nobody could see what was happening inside. If anybody else wanted to play it, I had to be present in the studio, and so forth and so on. It's typical of a lone inventor, is what I would call Raymond Scott. He had had an entire career with the public early in his life with the Raymond Scott Lucky Strike Hit Parade. He'd worked on radio, worked on television. He had his own band called the Raymond Scott Quintet. Now, of course, it was actually a sextet, but given Raymond's penchant, he didn't like the word sextet, so he therefore called it a quintet, even though it was six. At any rate, this Clavivox, which I'd like to speak about a little bit now, was not, as some people have tried to cast it, not a synthesizer at all. It had very limited timbral capabilities and very little control over those timbres. The word synthesis means to create something from its element parts, synthesize, to take the atomistic things of sound and to make a complete sound. It was not a synthesizer at all. It was a brilliant, if flawed, means of trying to affect something that I think it was very personal to Raymond. His daughter had a theremin, or he got her a theremin, she couldn't play it, and he decided, well, there needs to be a keyboard theremin that is controllable and can be played and so forth. Well, what was really brilliant about the Clavivox is it had a keying mechanism that rotated a vane, I think it was aluminum vane, inside of the instrument in this axis, and at the end of this vane was a photoelectric cell looking through a piece of plastic, that was graduated from completely opaque to completely transparent, and that's what made the scale. Unfortunately, the way the keys interacted with this vane, there were little U-shaped devices at the back of each key, and they were kind of made out of this fiberboard stuff. Well, unfortunately, as soon as you started hitting the keys and so forth, they deformed and it could never really be in tune. As a matter of fact, it never occurred to me that we would be successful at renting the Clavivox in studios in Nashville. By this time, I just wanted to stay in touch with Raymond because he was such an interesting man and a genius, I believe. So what was interesting, though, about the design, had it worked, was that you could teeter-totter between keys. As you press down one key, this vane moved it to a certain angular position, and you press down the other key, it would move to the other, so you could go back and forth. Well, the upshot of this is portamento was under the control of the performer. Unlike the synthesizer, people think portamento, I'm talking about glide, which people call it in the synthesizer, they think it's under control. Not really. It's what I would call ex post facto. You hit a note, you set the amount of glide, you hit another note, and then the timing of the glide determines when it will get up to the second note that you hit. Well, you didn't have that problem with the Clavivox. And it also had some very interesting left-hand features, for accenting notes and extinguishing notes, stopping notes. So you could go do-dot, 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 which of course would fit Raymond's background in jazz. When I first met Raymond, the first instrument I ever saw and heard and watched him actuate was the electronium, which later I think became known as the Scottronium, when he was associated with Motown Records possibly. Now the electronium, in actual fact, was not a synthesizer either, possibly with the caveat that it would fit in the lineage of encoded performance synthesizers. Clockwork had been the earliest start of the idea of codes that can be used to make music. Clocks, automatons that whistled and sang, and so there's a long history about clockwork, and the idea of encoded performance starts in 1929 with the Couple Givelet four-voice instrument shown at the Paris Exposition, and it goes through the Hannert synthesizer, or electrical orchestra he called it, the RCA synthesizer, Earl Kent's electronic music box prior to the RCA, and so forth. So there's a long line of these encoded performance things. You could possibly fit it in that category, but it would be difficult. Again, it had not a whole lot of timbral control. When you listen to the extant recordings, it's pretty apparent. But it was brilliant in this doctorate in primitive engineering way that Raymond had. So when I first heard this, I'd just been to see Eric Sade of ABC Logo and On Martineau, had done jingles with early Moog stuff, very famous guy in his day, and Wendy Carlos, of course, who everybody knows who she is, and of course everybody was doing their music one line at a time. And then I heard Raymond, and he stepped up to the electronium, he sat down, and I was right there with him, this huge array, of all these switches and knobs and things, and a backdrop against a whole wall of things that he had developed to make musique concrète and jingles and so forth. Well, he actuated the electronium with one little micro switch. And he would say things like, "This is a composing machine, Tom. It's not a synthesizer. It's not a Hammond organ. It's none of those things." And he would say things like, "Well, let it suggest a theme." And he would move the little micro switch and you'd get some sound coming out. Then he would say, "Well, let me widen the intervals." He'd flip a couple of switches up here, and yes, it widened the intervals. "Well, let me change the rhythmic aspect in this way." And in other words, it really was a composing machine that you collaborated with.